Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I won't take that full 5 minutes, and I appreciate your indulgence. Some of us were over at the Capitol and at a Rotunda funeral there, and but I do want to ask that my full statement be included as a matter of the record and say how much I appreciate you convening today's hearing to continue the conversation on how these massively wealthy and powerful big tech platforms are using persuasive technology and how they're profoundly altering our future. There's also a growing bipartisan consensus that we need to shed greater light on the secretive content that the moderation processes that social media companies use. And it's time, in my view, to make big tech more transparent, more accountable. And I look forward to working with you and our colleagues on this committee to get legislation like the Filter Bubble Transparency Act and the PACT Act across the finish line. So I want to thank each of the witnesses for their participation in this important hearing, particularly as the committee works to enact meaningful legislation to hold big tech accountable. And I, again, will submit my entire statement for the record. Mr. Eccles, there's a growing concern that large technology platforms may one day know every individual even better than we know ourselves. In your written remarks, you discussed the vast amount of data internet platforms have on users and that these platforms are able to predict certain outcomes for every individual based on this data. Could you talk further about how internet platforms use algorithms to make predictions about each user and how they influence the behavior of every individual, and perhaps how that might concern you?
Thank you, Senator Thune. I would say while some of these tech giants have a lot of data about many of us, we're a little ways off from having that kind of a mastery. Sometimes it seems like the people most convinced of that mastery are the tech critics and marketing snake oil salesmen like the people at Cambridge Analytica who were suggesting that they really could control people and they could predict them so well. So I think we have a bit of time in that sense. What I've been sometimes concerned about in the past is when this ability to predict people's behavior, how they'll respond to messages, reaches across many domains. Maybe I've interacted with one firm where I've bought some products. Can they also use that same data to know how to persuade me in politics? Could they sell that for that purpose? Could they use that same data to help me stick with my fitness goals? So there could be some benefits there as well. But in a lot of cases, when that data jumps from one domain to another, I think that's a potentially concerning area. And when you have single firms that reach into so many parts of our lives, we think they might be able to start doing that kind of cross-domain prediction. So that's one of the aspects that I find concerning, is that it may be hard for consumers to understand that this data about some purchases I made could also be used in conjunction with some other data about other people to predict my behavior in a totally different setting and to target totally different types of messages, maybe political messages to me. So that's one aspect that I find concerning because there's this opacity and it's a little hard for consumers to understand the consequences of this one disclosure for this very other setting.
Mr. Polis, what's your reaction to Mr. Eccles' testimony highlighting the vast amount of data these companies have on individual users, and do you believe that large tech companies use persuasive technology, meaning the technology is designed to change people's attitudes and behaviors?
Thank you, Senator. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is it's inherent in the nature of this technology. This is a communications technology, and other communications technologies, probably all of them in history, have been used and were inherently designed to influence people and to cause changes in their behavior. The printing press, radio, television, these things are a part and parcel of, whether you want to call it mind control or something more benign. I mean, this is how it works with human beings. We communicate with each other, and those who have the most control over communications infrastructure and technology wield that control to move hearts and minds, sculpt behavior. So I think it's inherent to digital technology. I think that we need to be aware that what's really going on here is the amassing of personal information inside databases so that large groups of people can be conditioned in certain ways to accept and prefer certain ways of life, certain ways of government. That's just kind of baked into the technology, and that's why it's so important that we make sure that ordinary Americans have the ability to use technologies to build institutions that serve their humanity and protect their country and their culture.
I want to come back to that, but let me ask Mr. Eccles, you mentioned in your testimony that quantifying the impacts of algorithm ranking is quite difficult due to the complexity of both technical aspects of algorithms and due to people's complex responses to changes with algorithms. If this is the case, what should policymakers require or expect of internet platforms with respect to algorithm explanation or transparency?
Thank you, Senator. I think the answer is going to be different in different settings. So in some settings, some of the most important error-sensitive settings, like diagnoses in healthcare, are not nearly as subject to such rapid strategic responses. And so while I don't study the healthcare system, I think this is something that the federal and state governments are actively involved in already. And so it would be natural for them to regulate quite closely the adoption of algorithms in those settings. When it comes to communication technologies and social media, it's not clear exactly what type of transparency we need. In fact, these algorithms often can be broken up into multiple different pieces, as I've detailed in my testimony. And that can be one tool for how Congress and other policymakers can get some transparency. So I don't know if Congress should mandate explanations and transparency, but I hope that my testimony provides kind of a blueprint for what questions should be asked of these firms. So they should be able to tell you and the public how much weight they put on predictions of clicks, predictions of reshares and retweeting versus how much weight they put on predictions of survey responses about whether people say this is really important to me, or how much weight they put on potentially negative signals that tell them that people regret their engagement, that maybe they spent too long on the platform, or that they wish they hadn't reshared that piece of misinformation. And so by being able to tell policymakers and the public about those weights, I think that provides one opportunity. I mean, as I was preparing my written testimony, I was really struck with some of the reporting in the New York Times about TikTok, and it turns out their algorithm matches exactly what I had written without really any knowledge of that, except that it seems to lack many of those signals. They seem to not be, at least according to this reporting, collecting data about people's more considered opinions of whether this was a worthwhile video to have seen, or any signals that I saw this and then later I felt misinformed or misled. And so probing that and pushing platforms to actually be more sophisticated in their algorithms, I think could be beneficial.
So qualitative as opposed to quantitative. Just very quickly, and I know my time expired, Mr. Chairman, but since I didn't use my 5-minute opening statement, I want to just ask one question. And Mr. Polis, coming back to what you said about these are communications mediums, and in other words, designed to influence people. And you said that who decides, you know, I mean, I want to come back to this question. You said that decisions should be made about these being used in a way that's positive or good for humanity. And I guess my question is, and the thing that I think concerns a lot of us is who decides what is good for humanity? Who is behind the curtain making these decisions? And then I want to ask you this question because I think it sort of gets at you discussed the notion that we're in the nascent stage of a social credit system with regard to the use of AI and algorithms on internet platforms. And I'm curious as what your thoughts are about what approaches Congress should be considering to prevent a social credit system. So if you could answer that question, but maybe answer the bigger question about who decides what is good for humanity.
Sure, that's a very good question, Senator. Ultimately, this is a government by, for, and of the people. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we grapple with the question of how to ensure that our form of government is not replaced by a social credit system. The reality is that every major power in the world right now, every civilization state, as some call them, is racing to establish sovereign authority over the digital technology within its territory. And because of the way that these super powerful digital entities raise ultimate questions about our place in the universe, about what it is to be human, why we should bother. We seem to have created things that are bigger and smarter and have superpowers that we lack. So many countries are responding to that kind of feeling of disenchantment or fear. by turning to their deepest cultural resources, which are in many cases theological resources. You see China with the Great Firewall and trying to focus on making algorithms and programs Taoist. Russia's response to the digital revolution was to build a very large military cathedral just outside of Russia. And in countries in the West, like France and others, they're actively looking for ways to make sure that digital technology really captures and expresses and even enforces their particular cultural leanings. You see India pursuing some of these things, and Israel and others. In the U.S., we have a First Amendment, and we have a prohibition on the establishment of a religion. So we really, we have a special challenge because we can't sort of take that theological, theocratic option and say, look, the government is going to decide, what the proper system of ethics is, what counts as harm, whether something like transhumanism is something that people shouldn't be exposed to, or whether it's something that actually exposes them to what they need to know in order to flourish. The federal government needs to make sure that it doesn't nationalize social media in an effort to turn it into a tutelary system that programs Americans the way that they want Americans to be programmed. So, I think the best. Yeah, sure. The best option is to make sure that Americans can buy and use digital technologies, high-powered GPUs, Bitcoin, so that they can freely build new institutions, cultural and market institutions, in a digital environment where they can freely protect their human identity and make sure that we preserve our form of government, can argue openly about fundamental political questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.